excited to have you here for the opening of our exhibit, Roots of Recreation. And the exhibit shares a little bit about every one of the parks in Marshall County, including the county-wide parks. So I hope you enjoy it. There's some really good information there and some interesting facts and some interesting displays. So take your time and peruse the exhibit when this is over. And it is my pleasure to introduce to you a gentleman who has made a career out of helping homeowners and communities get the historic status that they deserve. And he is one of our best speakers, always willing, always knowledgeable. And so I would like to introduce our county historian to you, Mr. Kurt Garner.
It's kind of funny, and I was mentioning this just before. So there are times when the Historical Society contacts me and asks me to speak on a topic, and I usually go off topic, so be prepared for that. But then there's also times when the Historical Society asks me, hey, why don't you just come in and speak on any topic you want to, and I give them the topic, and I still go off topic. So it doesn't matter whether they're asking me or if it's, kind of self-imposed. So what I'm going to do, I'll talk about parks. I'm certainly going to talk about parks. So many of our parks owe their built landscape to the New Deal era kind of projects, right? So what I'm going to do is I'll talk about the New Deal, and most of you know what that is, I'm sure, right? We all know what the New Deal is. Roosevelt's programs during the 1930s, they call them the alphabet programs. I'll talk a little bit about that, kind of go into what that means or what that looks like in Indiana, and then how that looked in Marshall County. And then I'll talk about parks a little more generally, Marshall County's parks. And I'm going to apologize in advance. Sir, you got a Bourbon volunteer firefighters, is that right?
Yeah.
I do not have a Bourbon park in here. So if you feel like you need to get up and leave now, that I'm not offended by that.
So we're here for Potawatomi.
Oh, all right. Well, I do have a brief reference to Potawatomi. So we'll get started. One of my favorite parks is Turkey Run. Many people have been to Turkey Run. And I've always wanted to go there when there was snow. And by golly, they've gotten more snow than what we have this year. So I went down there and managed to take a lot of photos. So that's just one of my photos. So we're going to go for a hike. We're not going to go outside in the ice and snow, but we'll take our hike around some parks. So like I said, many of our parks owe their existence to WPA era, federal relief era kind of projects during the 1930s. And so much of that, is represented by, the imagery that I think kind of comes to mind from that time period. And so, particularly the Conservation Corps, they did a number of state parks and national parks and forestry projects. So I'm just going to throw that up there because there's lots of alphabet kind of programs. But if I say WPA, just forgive me because there might be some things that were actually CCC versus WPA, but we'll just march through this. So most people, when they think about WPA or those federal relief era projects, they think about kind of our major national parks, right? So, and President Roosevelt, responsible for getting that going. The one in the upper right-hand corner is the dedication of Smoky Mountain National Park. And then the lower one here is the CCC. They're developing, I think that's Sequoia National Park. And then the Hoover Dam was a major infrastructure project that was done during the New Deal era. So this is typically what we think of, right? Yellowstone Park and Tetons and all that built infrastructure that came with it. But, oh no, it flashed. It's going to stay, right, Iris? All right, yeah, all right. We have to have a little faith. But the WPA and those federal projects did so many more things than just built parks. they built streets and sidewalks. I mean, on a very local level, they were building streets and sidewalks in your towns. They opened libraries, they did rural library delivery. And my favorite artist is Grant Wood, and there was a whole program built around artwork. So Grant Wood was appointed the director of the Public Works Art Project in Iowa. So, and we'll see some more of this type of work. But anyway, there were all these other things that kind of came along in that New Deal era. And just the WPA alone, one alphabet, right, employed 8.5 million people between 1935 and 1943. So 8.5 million people were employed just in the WPA alone. Now, women were also employed, but they were usually given lower paying jobs. I can't imagine why. But anyway, but they did other programs. So they taught nursery schools. There were school lunch programs were started during that time period. They took care of elderly people. But still, even at the height, only 13.5% of the employed people in those New Deal projects were women. Some interesting things kind of came out of that, particularly for Marshall County, and I'll get to that in a second. They transcribed state and county records, made indexes of persons and firms. In fact, Marshall County is one of, I think all of Indiana counties were done by WPA workers. And then they also did cemetery inscriptions and locating cemeteries. So much of the genealogy work, I think, we can thank, or those records we can thank this era. And they built outhouses. Did you know they built outhouses? So, and I'll talk a little bit more about this. Oftentimes, you could get a New Deal grant, so a federal whatever alphabet grant, if your community or your county or your state supplied the materials. And it was no different than the outhouses. So say you're a poor farmer, and this is my outhouse, and can you believe I could not find a picture of the outhouse after it's been painted and stuff? So I have restored the outhouse since then, but at some point, the Thomas family, who owned the farm before us, they said, we'll take advantage of that, we'll pay for the materials, and then in this situation, I think it was done through the county sent out the laborers to build the toilets. But they had to be a certain type of toilet. So they were introducing sanitation to many of these rural farms with these new toilets. So I didn't know this. A lady had, Jan Schubert Eric, some of you might know her. She used to be the director president for Lincoln Highway Association. She stopped at the farm and she goes, "You have an Eleanor." And I'm like, "What are you talking about?" And Eleanor Roosevelt was the one that really pushed sanitation and Department of Health standards. So, yeah, she said sometimes it's called the Roosevelt, sometimes it's called the Eleanor. Have anybody heard that term? All right, thank you. I'm not crazy, trust me. Well, I am crazy, but all right. So we'll talk a little bit about the New Deal in Indiana, and I'm going to kind of go through several projects that I'm really familiar with that happened in Indiana. And again, it went beyond our state parks. I did a project down in Covington, their courthouse, and there was a handful of courthouses that were built in Indiana during that time, and they were using funds. So federal government would supply labor, and sometimes they would supply funds or low-interest loans, and then the counties would take advantage of those. Fabulous court. I mean, I love the Art Deco style, and you don't see many Art Deco courthouses. This one's fabulous. It has, if you see in the background, there's a mural, so it has several murals too that were done in the courthouse. But this is typically what we think of when we think of Indiana and the New Deal. It's more of those parks and infrastructure projects. So the photo on the left is the CCC monument, Versailles State Park, and their dam was built by the CCC. The old photo that's kind of in the middle, that's the entrance to Tippecanoe State Park, Tippecanoe River State Park. And then the photo that's up in the upper corner, that's the dedication of George Rogers Clark National Monument and the bridge there in Vincennes, which the bridge in Vincennes, if you heard my bridge speech, is my favorite bridge in Indiana because it's all carved with these Art Deco. Has anybody been to Vincennes, know what I'm talking about? Sorry, I don't have a picture of the close-up of the bridge. But you see the bridge in the background, and the dedication is actually happening at the monument. But, they did other things, right? So, the New Deal era paid for photographers to go out and actually capture life in rural Indiana, and just general topics too, but particularly in rural Indiana. And the Great Flood in 1937, they had photographers that were already working throughout the state, and so they went and they took photos, and we have an incredible documentation of the flood in 1937, which really impacted mostly southern Indiana. Decatur Homesteads projects. Anybody been to Decatur, Indiana? Do you know where this is at? So there was one project developed in Indiana. It was strictly housing, and it employed architects, employed civil engineers, and then it took a piece of property and kind of think of it almost like as a habitat kind of program today, where if you proved you could work, then you would get basically like an interest-free loan, and you would pay off that house, and then it became a homeowners association. So there's one project in Indiana for actual homesteads, and they were called homesteads. So if you look at Homestead in Kansas, it's going to be the same type of project, all right? But Indiana had one, and there were 2 farms, and the 2 farms did not succeed. The Homestead project was really popular, and it's still actually a really desirable place to live in Decatur today. The farms, and maybe I've shared this before in another presentation, the farms, because they were considered like socialism, they were called like Hitlerville and Little Germany or something like that. So there were 2 farms. One was by Vincennes and the other one was by Lagodi, get that right. But anyway, those did not succeed, and they ended up being sold off. But the Homesteads project was successful. Here's what I was talking about. So there were book transcriptions and indexes across the country. WPA went through each county in Indiana and created a list or an index of persons and firms. And you can find those at the state library. But I think one of the more interesting things is, particularly if you're interested in genealogy, is the fact that they recorded so many cemeteries at that time too. A couple of projects I've worked on. The Rensselaer Post Office was a WPA project, and yes, there's one in Marshall County. Does anybody know what that one is? All right, we'll get to it. And then Marquette School in South Bend was also a WPA project. And again, part of that was federal government, federal funds. Some of it was federal funds and local funds, and then always WPA labor. And this was something that I didn't know. In fact, none of my friends in the preservation kind of circles in Indiana knew this, but I came across this article maybe 2 years ago, and it was WPA that went around and recorded the state's historic sites. So the original kind of preservation movement in Indiana, which stemmed out of this, came out of that WPA era. So they had listed a map of Indiana in this newspaper article. They listed a state map, and they show all the sites that were being recorded and then planned for restoration during that time. And of course, you know what the bottom picture is? Who knows what it is? Oh, come on, you can say it.
Original State House in Corrigan.
The original State House in Corrigan, thank you. And of course, parks. I mean, they did community parks too. This is a project that I was involved in the restoration. This is the original park administration building in Michigan City, and it was done through WPA labor. And that was a situation where the community provided, the city provided the materials, and WPA built it. And what's interesting about Michigan City Parks and the other example up here in Terre Haute is that because the materials had to be donated, sometimes communities got very savvy about how they were going to find materials to donate for the projects. So in Michigan City, if you've ever been to Washington Park in Michigan City up around the beach, have you ever noticed that there's like a lot of salvage material that composes their park structures? So next time you're up there, take a look at it. But you can see it's like rubble from buildings that have been torn down. Some like that gateway is like some type of limestone pieces that came off of another building. A project that I just recently completed was a study on the Chauncey Rose Plaza. So it's this plaza at, what's the name of the park? On the Wabash River there in Terre Haute. And this one's really fascinating to me because the bottom picture is the original federal post office building that was built in Terre Haute. It was being replaced with New Deal money to build a new post office and new federal building. And so the architect was charged with taking the limestone, and you see those big porticos? They took those off the building. I just can't fathom this in 1930s. They took those off the building and then they rebuilt it as the plaza. So if you're ever in Terre Haute, you see that. You see all the carving up in the pediments of that building. That came off the original post office. I just can't fathom like deconstructing that, and at least they weren't using horses by that time. Although maybe WPA. So at the height of the New Deal programs in Indiana, there were 59 camps. So CCC camps, WPA camps, there were 59 camps. The average salary for an Indiana enrollee in 1939 was $1,651 a year, which probably was a pretty decent amount. I should have done the math on what that is today, but that was the average pay. In 1935, Indiana was second in the nation. Now imagine this. We were second in the nation for the number of enrollees, people working in the WPA. So we were behind the New York City district. So most states were their own district, and then like New York City was a larger district, right? So we were only second behind New York City. And the next one was Pennsylvania, and they had a population 3 times, right? 3 times the size of Indiana. So imagine that. Indiana was, we had a lot of people working in WPA. In 1935, there were 61,616 Hoosiers that were employed just in the WPA. And then I had mentioned this, that large force of Hoosiers that had been assembled working in the WPA then were dispatched in 1937 to help with flood relief in southern Indiana. All right, now we get to Marshall County. I'm going to talk about New Deal era projects in Marshall County and parks, and then I'll go more into just kind of some other parks in Marshall County. Centennial Park was the one that I think most people think of when they think of WPA work in Marshall County. But its origins are not with WPA. So it was already developed. You see the map in the upper left-hand corner. By 1880, it was already being used as a park. And there's a lot more information, I'm sure, in your present or in your displays that you have the opening for today. But it was being used in the late 1800s as a park. And then it developed into Centennial Park only after the state centennial. I'm correct on that, right? That's what I thought. All right. So, and for it was a state centennial, right?
No, we're left. It's Sue actually did the Plymouth, so she's not here to confirm.
Oh, all right.
Maybe you need to-
Well,
I think so.
I'm
yeah.
pretty sure it would be the
I think
state
I've heard
centennial.
that, yeah.
Because before, so the map here is from 1922, where it says Centennial Park and Centennial Park Track. In 1908, it was still being referred to as the Agricultural Fairgrounds. So it was not called a park, it was not Centennial Park yet. So I would imagine it had been during that time. But I think that this picture is just a great one. 1922, they've got the fairgrounds, they've got the grandstands, they've got a racetrack because it was still primarily agricultural based. So those were horse races that were going on there. I don't know if anybody took their cars out there, but I'm pretty sure it was just horse races. And then the other thing that I think is interesting, because I live on Sultanite Ditch, you see the Woodward and Brush Creek. So that's the Sultanite Ditch that comes in to feed the Yellow River there in the park. And at this time, it was originally known as Brush Creek. That was an Indian name for it. And then Woodward owned the property kind of extending up to the north, and so then they named it after Woodward, but then it became Sultanite. And I just found these online. I'm sure that you guys have these in your displays, but these are postcard views from the 1940s, about 1940, of Centennial Park and all the WPA work that was done. Has anybody seen these photos before? I don't know that I'd ever seen the one on the bottom. I had seen the one on top. But you know, that whole hillside was developed with rock and rubble, and I'm sure that the guys that were building this probably just went out to the farms and gathered up the stone that, you know, always got thrown to the side. But just some great photos there. And the pillars are there mostly. I feel like I remember that little pagoda thing, but it's not there anymore, I don't think, is it? Does anybody know? I feel like I remember it, but maybe it's just because I'd seen it before, but yeah, great photos. And then here's two other photos, and I like this, you know, the guys that I think they're fishing off the bridge there. And I've thrown in a couple of, you know, more personal photos, because I mean, like, that's what kind of endears us to our parks, right? We've gone there, we've done things. That's my whole senior class there, by the way, of 1987. I went to Grace Baptist, so there were 6 of us. It wasn't a lot of work to be co-salutatorian, and yes, I said co-salutatorian, so. And then, of course, you know, this is what most people in Indiana know Centennial Park for today, right? And how many people say, meet me at the bridge? Everybody always says that, right? And of course, so now everybody meets you at the bridge. Well, now it's just always full, so it's usually not that easy to get through. This is the other one that Plymouth is probably known for, and really is kind of a gem that I don't feel gets the same enough attention. But the Conservation Clubhouse at Magnetic Park. Again, Magnetic Park was being used as a park before WPA came along. And in the little map there, you see Zahner Mill. So it was a mill property, and then it was converted into the clubhouse property, and all became part of the park. But here, you know, there are, how many have had a wedding reception, anniversary, family reunion, class reunion? Yeah, I mean, because that's what, so these are where our memories are held, right, at these places. And this is, I found these photos a while ago. I was doing the presentation on the Yellow River, and this is the Zahner Mill, so you can see it there. And this was just before they purchased it to become part of Magnetic Park. And if you look real closely, hopefully you guys can see this. That's the old flowing well structure. So the structure that's built there with the stone today, the well, this is the old structure right here. And you can see it in yellow, that circle in the Sanborn map there. I think that's a pretty fascinating photo. But then there were other, you know, WPA projects. Again, just like Marquette School, there were schools that were funded with WPA. So Centennial Gym, which was an auditorium, which is no longer there, that was a WPA project. And that was Centennial for the city's Centennial, rather than state, obviously. And then the original portion of Bremen School, which my mom would remember. And here I just grabbed this photo off of Google Earth, and here they're covering it up. I didn't realize that this was even happened, but the original portion of Bremen Schools was their consolidated school, and it was helped, the WPA loans were generated, or it's what generated the funding for that school. what's interesting about that, and I couldn't find the article, or I got it someplace. It was like one of the last federal relief projects in Marshall County, was the construction of the consolidated school. I think it was like early 40s. So by 1943, you know, now we were gearing into going into World War II. Yeah, that was one of the last projects that were funded in Marshall County. And then, you know, things we don't think of. Well, first of all, the Culver Post Office was a WPA project, and the mural there. Has anybody seen the mural? I mean, it's great because it fits Culver. It's cadets receiving the mail. I think that's the name of the artwork. But then also in La Paz, for a very brief time, there was a program that built fire stations, and La Paz's original fire station was built by WPA. It's a tile block building. Is it still there? Because they don't use that building anymore. You know, my dad's supposed to be able to help me here. But anyway, I couldn't find a picture of the building, but I did find a picture of their first fire engine, and it's parked outside the building. And that article about the fire engine says that it's going to be housed in the building that was just built by WPA. And it had a different alphabet to it. But then also, you know, they were doing major road infrastructure projects. Imagine crossing, you know, Highway 31, of course, Old 31 today, but imagine that at grade at the railroad. And so they actually built the overpass with federal money, federal relief money. So that's also a Google Earth picture there, obviously, unless Michigan's painted on the road. I don't think it is. This is another one of the county's really unique structures that were done with WPA funding. And that's the Isaac Walton League. Has anybody been down to this? Another fabulous little building. That was a situation where the Ikes, the Isaac Walton League, had already bought the property. They had already started developing it. And in order to take advantage of New Deal projects, they turned it over to the U.S. fish hatcheries. And through that, the labor was donated to build the ponds and the building itself. And that's a Fokker building, William Fokker, the STEM. Yeah, in 1935, there were 60 men working just at the fish hatchery site, so just building the ponds themselves. That was just before the building started. And then here's the brief reference to Potawatomi. So the landing, I was contacted about this back in the early 2000s, and I didn't know it existed, and just through some research on the Argus building, on the Isaac Walton League building, there was these references to the wall. And there's pictures of, so the historic picture in the bottom is at the Isaac Walton League building. And it has other pictures of WPA projects. So I think this is a WPA project, but here's the issue. They never built those on private property. And somehow that became private property because I worked with Creighton Brothers to get it to Potawatomi. I think it was about 2002 or 3, somewhere in that time period. And so I don't know. I mean, it certainly looks like WPA era work, but and there's a reference to something called Adams Landing, and the Ikes would go there to do fishing tournaments, and they said that it was at Tippecanoe. And so I wondered if that was more of what the official name was, and maybe there was a relationship there, and maybe it was just considered, since it's on the riverbank, maybe it's just always considered part of public property. But Creighton is who actually owned it when we got it transferred over. So you can go look, you can go find it. Sometimes it's halfway underwater, and we need to get it restored. I'll talk to Stefan about that, or Wyatt. The Culver Bathhouse is one of the projects, again, in Marshall County, and as part of that, they developed the beach park there in Culver. And then also Mill Pond Dam was actually part of a WPA project. somewhere the plaque is missing. So that used to have a plaque on it that talked about what it was and when it was built and all that, but it's probably in somebody's house. Two more, the Bremen Electric Plant was built during that time, again with those funds. And then the shelter, it used to be called Birchwood Park, but now it's the Bremen Conservation Club. That was also built, again, using that. You see, is there a theme here? Not just with stone being used, but I mean, it was touching every single community in some way or another. And it touched our roadways. And if you were here for the road presentation last year, I think that was last year, this was something that Karen Redinger and I kind of discovered together. She found the reference to Michigan Road and I found the reference to Lincoln Highway. But for a brief time, they were improving roadways across Indiana, the highways, with tree plantings and shelters. Some of you have seen those wood shelters. There's very few of those left. But this is east of Plymouth here. All right, we're almost there. Got a few others. So some other parks. So obviously, they didn't begin with WPA. It certainly didn't end with WPA. So I'm going to talk about a few other things that have evolved in Marshall County regarding our parks. That was the Trailway, by the way, back behind Menominee School. So most people don't think of the Menominee site as a park, but it was, for every intents and purposes, being developed as a park when it was the brainchild of Daniel McDonald, our original county historian. So dedicated in 1908, but it was getting improvements right along the way. And this little tidbit appeared in the newspaper. Every year this park is, I swear it's not me, every year, we'll hurry up and finish, right? Every year the park is growing into a more beautiful place, and when the various kinds of trees shall become of larger size, this park will be one of the most beautiful places in the county. That was from 1914, so 6 years after it was dedicated. And Dad, you've seen that photo before, I assume, right? You do know who that is, right?
It looks like Leslie from here,
Yeah, that's your grandpa, and that's you and Mike.
but I don't remember. And I don't have a copy of it, so I need a copy.
Well, I don't think I have this one. I found this one. I mean,
Well,
in
you
your
got it
stuff.
there, you can copy it.
Okay, I'll send you the. You like how I'm getting dressed down right now? All right. So anyway, people would use that as a picnic site. I don't see that too often anymore. We did take our kids out there one time, but anyway, it was developed as a park. And if you look closely in the photo on the left, you see the log cabin that was supposed to be a replica or a mini replica of Chief Menominee's the chapel. So if you've been to Argus, their Old Town Park on Michigan, that started as a cemetery. And so it was Green Slope Cemetery, and I pulled that image off of Find a Grave, which is a website. But that, in that situation, the town, it was, becoming unsightly. It was right on the main drag. The school was nearby. They decided they wanted to move it. And so family members were notified if they could find family members and said, hey, you can take your loved ones and move them to Maple Grove. And Garner did. So she took her grandparents so my great-grandmother took her grandparents to Maple Grove. But then a few of my family members remained there. So the Moore family, which married into the Barnhills or somewhere down the way. But yeah, so in this map on the left, I think that's from 1922. It still shows the cemetery, and now of course it's Green Slope. And the deal was that the town said that they would put up a monument with all the names on it. At the time, now they did, but that was just what, 5 years?
72 years after.
Yeah, 72 years after the fact. But at any rate, it's there now, and so if you have loved ones that are buried in Green Slope or now Memorial Park, you can find their names on that monument. And so from cemetery to park, and this is from waterworks to park. So this is in Bremen. This was a situation where, if you look at the map on the upper left-hand corner, and this all kind of ties into the bridge project, which Sandy knows well. So there were a couple of things going on. The railroad was expanding. The county needed to re-dredge what's we call the Army Ditch, which is actually the North Fork of the Yellow River, the East Fork, whatever they call it. And so they also had built their waterworks plant there at that site. So, and this is, if you're familiar with Bremen, Center Street runs north out of downtown, past the Bowman House, and then you cross the railroad, and that bridge where you cross the ditch and then the railroad, the depot used to sit on the west side, if you can kind of imagine this. All right, so they were redeveloping this whole area at this time. And so as soon as the county came through and re-dredged, because if you look up there, you see the old channel of the Yellow River. See that? And so they straightened it, and that became Shadyside Park. So we had a couple of family reunions up there years ago. But this has become, between Sunnyside and Shadyside Park, this has become really the main parks in Bremen. And here, the lower photo, if you hadn't seen that before, hadn't been in previous presentations, is them dedicating the new bridge that was built after the county dredged the river through. And then from Sandhill to Park. So this is an interesting story that is one of those that just kind of gets forgotten over time. So this is Marshall County Memorial Forest, and there were some guys in Culver, who were very interested in trying to do a conservation kind of project. And what they had found is that beavers kept building dams on the stream that flows through this property. And on top of that, no farmer could get anything to grow because it was a sand hill, blowout area. So these guys petitioned the state of Indiana, because before this, a county couldn't own property for conservation purposes. So they got the state legislature to pass an act allowing counties to purchase or accept property, and so it became Marshall County Memorial Forest. And oddly enough, so the photo on the bottom was Daniel Stauffer had done an Eagle Scout project there, right? So they're dedicating the sign, and we were looking for old photos. We could never find any photos of of anything about that park. I mean, there was one article. There was only ever one article that we could even find. Well, about 6 months after that photo was taken, somebody walked into the Culver Antiquarians and handed them a giant scrapbook with tons of photos of them planting, of what it looked like before. And so now we have a really great record of those historic photos, or of what the site looked like before it was planted. And I was there with Adam Theta. Now it's kind of under the purview of Marshall County Parks. I was there with Adam Theta about a year ago, and I hadn't been in the far kind of north end of it before. And you can still see a very regimented tree planting pattern there if you look. Most of the trees that were planted, they're old enough that you can't quite define where the boundary, where the rows were necessarily. But in other locations, there's, and obviously since then, 80 years ago, new trees have come up, and so you kind of can't quite tell. But there are a few places where you can still see a fairly regimented planting of the trees. That's just another thing. And then, all right, so here's a funny story. How many have heard of Founders Park? How many old timers are like, Founders Park, where is that at? So when I came to Plymouth and they were trying to get the trailway built, the original Greenway Trail built, there were a lot of protests. Does anybody remember this? And there were people along Randolph Street, like along the high school, because they were gonna route it down along the street. And people didn't want that, they didn't want it in their backyard. And so Paula Garris, who was the park director at the time, she said, well, how do we get it away from, so that we don't have property owners that are upset about it? And so I said, well, let's jump over the river and go into Magnetic Park, and then we'll jump back out of the river. And I'm the one that started calling it Founders Park. And it's because the addition that was made, do you remember houses down there? John, do you guys remember houses down there from that long ago? Whoever was, all right, so they built those in a floodplain, but the streets, when they platted it, they named it for the founders of Plymouth. So it's Searing, Polk, and who's the third one? Oh my goodness. Searing, Polk, and Blair, yeah, Blair. So they named it for the three founders, the streets that went around this little triangle. So I just started calling it Founders Park. Paula started calling it that. And I remember when they started developing the plans, people were like, Founders Park, where is that? When did that become a park? Well, it's just purely accidental. I'll take credit for naming it. But anyway, so it shows up on the signs. Those are my kids pointing in either direction. And then the most recent development, this is the last one, is River Park Square, right? And so it went from parking lot to park. And I found this old photo. Andrews University came in and did a study of downtown and kind of like visioning kind of study. And so that's a rendering that they did in the bottom right corner. But they'd taken that aerial. And remember the Harvey Mart that was down there in the old G&G Plaza. And that was a situation where Helen Glob, we just asked if we could start using it for the farmer's market. Do you remember when the farmer's market was still there, right? It was just a big asphalt, paving lot, paved lot, but you think about it, that's what parks are, right? There's something that you have to have a vision for, and it becomes reality. And so, and there's got the little kids. But, there it is today, right? What an improvement, right? So, parks are living things, right? And we all interact with them, and it's so cool to go down to River Park Square when the farmer's market is set up and all the interactions that are happening there today. And it's cool to go to the Mayor's Month of Music, right? And attend those, the big reunion ones, I don't know how many thousands of people are there. It's so encouraging to have something like that as part of your community when it used to be just a parking lot, right? So, that's it. Did I go too long? I will take questions, but I can't guarantee answers.
Have you heard of the bird park?
So, yes. And so I want you to tell me why they called it a bird park, because, go ahead.
Because they had built cages in there, big tall ones, and they had all kinds of birds in them. Everything from peacocks to whatever you want to name, And they took care of the birds there. And people used to go there to watch the birds.
So this is Magnetic Park. So if
Yes.
you don't, so this is
Yes.
Magnetic Park.
You
So
take Jackson Street East, past the Magnetic Park, and turns left.
yeah.
Okay, and then immediately right there's where the bird park was.
So were they caged in?
It's kind of like,
Because somebody said, well, was it an aviary? And typically when you think of an aviary, it's big cages, right?
They were huge. They were probably 15, 20 feet tall.
Do you have any pictures?
Do I have a picture?
Yeah.
We
Right,
have tried,
there
we have tried to get pictures of the birds, but we have never found anybody that has any pictures.
I got it right here.
Yeah, I know. 'Cause
Can you print
I think that was a government project too, that they were raised and sold, is what we.
Well, it might be. So if you read about the Isaac Walton League,
Mhm.
okay, they were interacting with a number of other organizations around the county, and they were introducing pheasants and quail and and fish, right, you know, in ponds. And so, I mean, maybe it was part of that, but you say you remember it,
Yeah. Used to.
and you don't remember it from the 1930s, so it was obviously after that.
It was probably closer to 1950.
Yeah. You know, I hear people talk about it, so I know what it is. I know it was Bird Park, but I was always kind of curious. Was it actually like cages, or did they just? Yeah, did they just have birds? You know, hey, come look at the birds. But
No, our
usually they were
understanding is
cages.
that they were cages too,
Yeah,
that's
they
what
were
we,
cages.
Yeah.
that's what we've been told.
Okay.
Yeah, but if
Gotta find
anybody ever
photos.
has
If
access
they
to
were-
photos, do let us know.
Yeah, I was wondering if the Isaac Walton, you mentioned once that they have got a lot of pictures in their building, and they're kind of reviving that. And I wonder if there are archives of other photos, and if they were interacting with Plymouth, there
It
might,
might be.
yeah, so who would
Although
you see about that?
Oh gosh, I don't know who that is anymore. There used to be a Bagley that was really involved in that, and he's passed away, I think.
There's an Overmeyer, an Overmeyer.
Like the two guys I used to go down there, they're both dead now.
Well, I appreciate you mentioning that. I should have thrown Bird Park in there just as a name, because there's fewer and fewer people that call it that. My wife calls it that, and she didn't, you know, she's younger than me.
Yeah, growing up, that's what we always called it, I didn't even know it was called Magnetic Park, we just always called it the Bird Park.
Exactly.
But I had
Exactly.
no
What we
idea
grew up
why,
calling
unless
it was
they're
the Bird
working
Park.
there.
Yeah.
Even after the birds were gone, huh?
There were no birds there, but it was still the bird park.
So how many times did it have to flood before they decided, you know, they weren't gonna
Yeah.
put the birds through
I
that?
don't think that part ever really flooded, I think it was always lower down there, because
So you said it
from
was
the
on
street
Jackson.
there, it drops off quite a bit down to the river.
It was up on the hill,
Yeah.
probably.
Oh, so it's where the playground equipment is then today?
I-
Because that's where that curves. It's high
where the
ground.
curve is, Yeah,
That
Okay.
makes sense.
yeah.
All right.
I remember, and this was because I was doing research on the different parks and was trying to figure out what Bird Park was. I remember looking and I saw one mention in a newspaper, but I can't remember what year it was, that it said there was one of the groundskeeper was keeping birds and he had them at the park, but that's as much of a mention as the newspaper had. And I was like, is that what the Bird Park was? There was a groundskeeper and he just was like, oh, it's got all this land, I might as well.
Well, it's kind of a bird park today. You have to watch where you step around there, the geese that are down there. But thank you for that. I appreciate that.
Used to drink out of the well
The well.
down there too, come to find out it's polluted.
Yeah. That was some of that magical water.
Yeah, people would fill gallons,
Oh, my grandpa was
bottles.
one of them.
Yeah.
He would go down there and fill jugs of water and bring them to us. Here's the good water.
Well, is there any other questions or comments, or? I feel bad I didn't include a Bourbon Park now. I think I hit every other community. I even hit La Paz.
Next time.
I think Bourbon's library was built by WPA. I'm not positive, but I think it was. All right, well, thank you for braving the weather today.